All right, then I would like to welcome you. I'm glad that people from so many countries are assembled here in the GPN. I see people from Ghana, from Jamaica, from Iran, and yes, South Africa, of course. Dear Devan, welcome. So Professor Devan Pillay will deliver the public talk today. And he is an old acquaintance of ours and a good friend and has been visiting us. Today's topic will be Ancient Lineages, Modern Reawakenings, Marx, Buddha, and the Pursuit of Happiness. And yes, we are very much looking forward. Professor Devan Pillay from Wits University, renowned expert on not only South African politics, but also trade union policy in general, regular contributor also to the Global Labor University, and has published too many articles and books to take your time with listing them at the moment. So without further ado, I will hand over the word to you, Devan.
Thank you, Aram, and welcome everyone. I can't say good morning or good afternoon because we are in all different time zones. I was thinking, how to pitch this talk, and I'm going to assume rather than, well, not to assume that there is a lot of knowledge amongst the attendees about this subject matter. I will try and give us full an account of my thinking process around, why Marx and Buddha. How does Marx and Buddha fit together? And the notion of happiness. Well, in fact, I could have put also the term eco-socialism in the title. And another version of this talk is Marx, Buddha, and the search for counter-hegemony. In fact, that's the a chapter in the book by it's coming out soon, published by Karpa which our colleague Milan Wani, who's part of our network, he has co-edited. So I'll speak to that chapter. So the thinking, around this it's something that I've been thinking about for a number of years. I come from one could call a labor background, a Marxist-oriented labor background, but a more of a democratic Marxist orientation, and not the Marxist-Leninist orientation. Maybe let's say a new left perspective, but nonetheless a perspective that while it placed much more emphasis on democratic processes and a critique of vanguardist Marxism, it did not necessarily incorporate ecological dimensions in its thinking. But I also come from a Hindu background, growing up in a Hindu family, and the ideas and thinking around compassion and the Gandhian principles of being socially engaged, but also having an internal process of transformation as you engage in political and social struggles, being vital parts of it. And I had these two dimensions within me for many, many decades. And in recent times, I thought, well, it's time I brought them together in a sense. And when I started on this line of thinking, I thought, wow, I was probably a maverick in this. But then as I went on, I discovered that there are more and more people thinking along these lines. So I'm not so far out of sync. So ancient lineages, and I will speak a bit more about that, refers to going back in time to the philosophy and thinking of the ancients. And it also includes indigenous thinking amongst the Native American people in Africa, etc. And the extent to which, and observing the extent to which these forms of thinking have been sidelined or neglected by the traditional left for much of the 20th century. And how, and so in a sense, this talk is addressed to a left audience that may still hold on to those 20th century conceptions. Now, we start off looking at what is the problem, and I think we will all acknowledge, in this audience at least, that we have the problem of a global capitalist hegemony, which manifests itself in different ways at different national levels. But the one common theme is economic growth, measured through the metric of the gross domestic product as being the key measure of development. And while this has been discussed and debated over the decades in the last century, this still remains, in fact, increasingly so, one could argue, in the mainstream, in the media, amongst economic thinkers. And even in my own country, if you look at the latest presidential speech, this understanding of development and economic growth, being economic growth, is still at the forefront. So everything else, such as sustainable livelihoods, health, education, material and psychological well-being, or happiness, as some put it, in Bhutan, for example, and the environment, all of these are subordinated to this metric. And economic growth, as we know, especially since the onset of neoliberal capitalism from the late 1970s onwards, is characterized by increasing and exponentially increasing global inequality, which, during the period of the COVID crisis has increased even more with the wealth of the few multiplying to astronomical amounts, George Bezos, all the tech companies, owners, etc. And this is legitimated by ideological discourses and institutional arrangements that have ensured widespread consent as the statist alternatives declined over the past century and no longer have the same resonance, whether social democratic or what is called communist, although that's a misnomer, because a communist, there's no such thing as a communist state. A communist means no state. But states run by communist parties is what is usually meant. Now, Piketty calls, in his latest book, he calls these inequality regimes. And now, yes, there is still a widespread consent, but also simultaneously renewed crises of legitimacy, as this inequality, miseration, manifests itself in different ways. But what is different to the previous century is that the pole of attraction for this crisis of legitimacy is not on the left, but as we know, it's on the right-wing populism, gaining increasing traction in different parts of the world. In India, Brazil, even South Africa, as we know, across Europe in different ways. It goes up and down to some extent, but nonetheless, right-wing populism is a major threat. Now, the left just does not seem to have a clear enough response because of the crisis of the statist alternatives, where the left, or the Marxist left in particular, analyzed or placed a lot of focus on analyzing capital, but perhaps insufficient focus on analyzing the state as an autonomous entity that's not just a reflection of capital, but has its own peculiar bureaucratic impositions over the people. So, the left takes power, they institute a statist regime, and they are as oppressive or even more oppressive than a capitalist regime. So we are in this crisis moment where the left is trying to find itself. The wave goes up and down in terms of its the traditional left's popularity in different spaces, but on the whole, you could see it as a general decline of labor movements, which were very strong in the 20th century, and a general decline of their associated political parties. However, we also at the same time see the rise of environmental movements of various kinds in different parts of the world, and non-class identity struggles of various kinds, whether it's feminist struggles, anti-colonial struggles, or the decolonial movement, sexuality struggles, etc., in different parts of the world. And this poses a problem for the left as to how to engage with these non-class identity struggles. Nonetheless, as global and national inequality increases to unprecedented levels, and as climate change and other environmental concerns threaten our very existence, including the new pathogens such as the COVID virus, there is increasing discussion, increasing calls around the world for a counter-hegemonic response that breaks down the walls between these movements and struggles, and tries to forge alliances across the divide. And that is the major challenge of our times. How do we break down these walls, both within the academy, amongst the left, the paradigmatic walls, as well as in actual struggle of movements and the labor movements and traditional labor movements and labor parties and socialist parties on the one side, and these other struggles on the other side. Of course, we have spaces around the world where they have been breaking this down, Bolivia, for example, but then they also have setbacks. Now, within this thinking is the age-old discussion about reform versus revolution, which Rosa Luxemburg posed at the beginning of the last century. And André Gorz, the French Marxist thinker, came along and reformulated that somewhat and talked about the distinction between reformist measures that are very narrowly framed within the context of the capitalist system and the state system as currently exists, and what he called non-reformist reforms, or revolutionary or transformative reforms. And keeping that in mind, the thinking here is inspired by that of Rick Turner, who was a philosophy and political science lecturer in South Africa in the 1970s, late 60s and 70s, who was a major intellectual inspiration for the reviving trade union movement. And he wrote a book with a chapter called The Necessity of Utopian Thinking, which does not ignore short to medium term reform. So utopian thinking that is not utopianism, that it floats in the air and is unconnected with reality, but a utopian thinking that includes this idea of non-reformist reforms, or what Eric Olin Wright called real utopias. So keeping alive the utopian imagination while also being rooted in the practical struggles of or day-to-day struggles, and the distinction between tactics and strategies, tactics being short-term and strategies being medium to long-term. So those are so keeping all of that in mind allows one nonetheless to still be bold and think beyond those immediate struggles, and what could a utopian imagination include. So on the one hand, the thinking here is the need to move beyond false dichotomies, something that is very much prevalent amongst ourselves, I would say, in the academy. The false dichotomies of, on the one hand, Western or modernist thinking versus non-Western or postmodern bodies of knowledge. I think that's a false dichotomy. In South Africa, this came up very strongly during the Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall movements a few years back, where Marxism and was regarded as an Enlightenment body of thinking must be discarded, and you only need to think about the decolonial frames of thinking. So many decolonial feminists and environmentalist activists and thinkers would be very dismissive of Marx and his insights into the inner logic of capital. Now, I believe they are as misguided in this dismissal as those 20th century Marxist-Leninists who marginalized feminist thinking. They paid lip service to it, or dismissed, as I said earlier, ancient and indigenous bodies of knowledge as being wholly pre-scientific and therefore valueless, if not harmful. So we need a new non-dualistic thinking that acknowledges, that asserts that all knowledge is produced globally and symbiotically and belong to the global community of humankind, even if some regions of the world were more scientifically advanced than others at different points in history. So how do we make these linkages between ancient bodies of thought, such as that of the Buddha, but not only the Buddha, and Marx's ecologically informed humanism? So there is an earlier Marx up to the 1850s that you could say was a product of Hegel and Enlightenment thinking and Western thinking. And then there's a post-50s Marx that was writing much more about colonial struggles in his journalism, and also increasingly became embedded in thinking around ecology. And in the last 20 to 30 years of his life, the ecological notebooks of Marx reveal a very deep appreciation of the ecological impacts of capitalism. And so this humanistic Marx, which Eric Fromm and others have written about, which talks about alienation, etc. This increasingly, many see a connection between that and many of this ancient thinking. and some of this have come into discussions, or let me say, I believe this linkage ought to come into these separate bodies of thinking, new exciting bodies of thinking around a Green New Deal, around happiness and well-being, and around eco-socialism. But unfortunately, when I've looked at these bodies of thinking, I see separate discourses, and they often don't even refer to each other. So how do we relearn the art of counter-hegemonic politics and broad alliances? Because if we don't, we leave the field open to right-wing populists and market entrepreneurs to exploit. And both are ever present in my country, in the African continent, around the world. The market entrepreneurs as well as the right-wing populists, and often they are one and the same thing, or they're two branches of the same phenomenon, as you find, let's say, in India today, where the left, apart from Kerala, is quite marginalized, as I understand it. So there's a meeting point, the more I look into it, between Marx and Buddha. The Dalai Lama, who is the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism, has said on a number of occasions that as far as socioeconomic theory is concerned, I am still a Marxist. Many Buddhists don't quite know that. When I went to Bhutan and I spoke to people there, they didn't know that. The Bhutan, they are the descendants of Tibetan Buddhism. They didn't quite realize that the Dalai Lama would say something like that, because they have, understandably, this aversion to China as a dominating power and its Marxist-Leninist authoritarian actions against Tibet and against any independent thinking outside their framework. So they associate Marxism with that Marxist-Leninism, but the Dalai Lama is a much more flexible and dialectical thinker. And a dialectical thinking, by the way, which is associated with Marx or Hegel, goes right back to ancient times, and Buddhists are very much immersed in dialectical thinking. So if the Buddha says he's a Marxist, can Marx be a Buddhist? Or let's say, can Marxist humanism, which was an integral part of his thinking, be compatible with core elements of humanist paradigms, both secular and religious, which stems from the insights of the philosophies of the Axial Age. Now, the Axial Age, it's a term coined by Karl Jaspers, and he was referring to between 800 and 200 BCE, before the Christian era. And these were thinkers that came from Greece, China, the Middle East, and India. And there was a remarkable cross-fertilization of ideas, whether they actually cross-fertilized in a real sense, or they were all responding to similar phenomena at their time, namely a rising class domination and inequality, violence, patriarchal and socially violent religious dogma and practice, etc. This was all happening at the time. And if you look at the Buddha's life, you will see portrayals of him moving out of his kingdom and encountering classless communities, the communities that Marx would have referred to as primitive communist societies, some of which still exist in India or under enormous threat from mining and other explorations in their tribal areas. Now, in response to this rising class domination, they emphasize universal love, respect for all human beings and nature, social equality and social justice for all, as well as a strong emphasis on personal liberation from suffering. All of this as a vital precondition for the liberation of others. So, yes, it's true that they spawned many of these thinkers spawned religious movements that became oppressive, but just as Marx spawned a whole state ideology that became oppressive. So we need to distinguish between the Buddha and Buddhism, although there's still a lot to be recommended about Buddhist practice, but nonetheless, the Buddhism in practice became associated with feudalist regimes and also compromised with kings in order to be able to propagate their way of thinking. Just as Marxism, once it became a state power, became something else. I'll come back to that. But what many of these thinkers, quite remarkably, and Armstrong, has amongst others, has written a remarkable book looking at all these different ideas. And the one strong thread is what is called the Golden Rule. I don't know if you're all familiar with the Golden Rule. I think you are, but you probably don't necessarily know it as the Golden Rule. And was popularized by Christianity, but actually it existed many centuries before Christianity became into being. And that is, do to others as you would have them do to you. Or love your neighbor as yourself. And that's certainly embedded in Buddhist thinking, but also in these other philosophical thoughts and ideas in China, in the Middle East and elsewhere. Now, if you think about it, when you say do to others as you would have them do to you, or love your neighbor as yourself, that's a very strong social solidaristic message, right? Which can only be socialist, in essence. If by socialist you understand as meaning the democratic expression of society, of the people, the social solidarity of the people. So the social, as opposed to the market and as opposed to the state, the market and the state as two spheres that can be very oppressive, and society being where the people reside. The expression of people's social interaction and solidarity. That for me is where socialist, the understanding of socialist comes from. Of course, it's identified with the state, and that's the state socialist violence, which has sullied the term in many ways. Now, so you had all these different religious movements: Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Taoism, Confucianism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All of these religious movements draw from these ideas of compassion, of social solidarity, of the Golden Rule. But of course, they also depart from that. as we know, and can be the source of immense violence against women, against those who do not follow the creed, once they become institutionalized as bureaucratic institutions that are designed to protect the interests of the priestly class, and then as well, and then later on, the economic classes that are allied to them, as well as the state rulers. So that triangle of the priest, the state, and the merchant, and later the capitalist, that's the triangle that we are still living through in different ways today. And the people are caught up in between that. So whilst Marx warned against religion as the opium of the people, he also saw that religion was the groaning of the laboring creature or the soul of a heartless world. So he had a dialectical view of religion. It wasn't just one thing, it was a complex thing. And the spirit of spiritless conditions. Of course, Marx felt that under communism, eventually, with a humanist atheism would prevail, or what John Bellamy Foster, the ecological Marxist, calls sustainable human development. So for him, communism and sustainable human development is really sustainable human development if you think through the full logic of Marx's thinking. Where all human beings would develop to their full potential in harmony with the laws of nature. So in such a context, the belief in a higher power external to humans would eventually die out, because now people will be empowered to believe in themselves and their collective power, individual and collective power. So the spirit of religious spirituality would be replaced by the spirit of an atheist socialism, where alienation from the self, from fellow human beings, nature, production, and consumption would be overcome. As Foster puts it, the metabolic rift capitalism has entrenched between humans and non-human nature, and by extension between humans and their individual and collective selves, who are part of nature, would be overcome. So this thinking, even though it talks of an atheism from Marx, nonetheless has been inspirational to many religious scholars, radical scholars. For example, the Christian theologians Ulrich Duchra and Franz Hinkelamp, and they quote Marx as arguing for the overthrow of all relations in which the human is debased, enslaved, abandoned, and has a despicable essence. And as such, for them, Marx could be advocating the restoration of the soul, of the spirit in a caring world based on social and environmental justice. So in this sense, his humanistic, atheistic, yet spiritual socialist vision, or in Buddhist terms, a compassionate socialist vision, which is pivoted on the flourishing of all humankind, and that type of thinking resonated strongly with that of the Buddha, who existed about 500 years BCE, and who also drew, but the Buddha himself was an atheist or agnostic, and drew on the rationalist agnostic Samkhya school of Hindu philosophy. So there's a strong resonance in that sense between a humanist Marx and a Buddha. Both of them are atheistic, don't believe necessarily in a higher power that created the world. But there are other thinkers who do talk about Christian or Muslim or Hindu, others who talk about gods and external powers. But nonetheless, in practice, there's still a lot of commonality in terms of what they are talking about. In India, Ambedkar was a contemporary of Gandhi and who fought against caste oppression. And he was a socialist. He was also inspired by the Buddha. And Ambedkar was a Dalit from the lower caste. And he saw and they drew inspiration from the Buddha. And in fact, he was born a Hindu, but he became a Buddhist because in his study of the Buddha and his thinking, that he was regarded as the first major campaigner against Brahmanism. Brahmanism being the priestly caste that dominates or controls what is called Hinduism, although it wasn't called Hinduism at that time. It was only called Hinduism much later on by the British. But nonetheless, Brahmanism and caste oppression. And so while some Dalit activists, and many of them identify with the Black radical tradition from the USA, see the need to discard Marx in favor of the Buddha and Ambedkar. And when I went to India a few years ago, we had this conversation with these Dalit activists. And then discovered that in talking to them about Marx, they were talking about a particular form of Marxist Leninism, which is very popular in India, which an economistic Marxism, and not the ecological humanist Marx that I've been referring to. But there are others in India who see a strong complementarity between what Ambedkar, who himself also debated, he wrote a pamphlet about Marx and Buddha. Ambedkar, Buddha, Marx, a strong complementarity like Tel Tumde. So when we look at these debates, we find that there's a lot of talking past each other. And a need to, and purists on all sides, retreating into a fundamentalist type of thinking, whether it's a Marxist, Leninist fundamentalist or postmodernist fundamentalism, although postmodernists might not want to be seen to be fundamentalists, but there's a fundamental rejection of Marx among some postmodernists, or subaltern thinking, which comes out of a Gramscian Marxism, but then gets discarded, etc., etc. And moving away from this economistic interpretation of class to an understanding not just of class as being about economic exploitation, but class domination, something that Ralph Miliband, the British Marxist, wrote about already in the 1980s. Class domination doesn't only include economic class exploitation, but race, caste, gender, and other forms of domination, including the spoliation of nature as part of one complex process of class rule. If you adopt that approach, then we see a lot of space for complementarity amongst these different schools of thought. So, similarly, while most religions can be understood as being in origin movements of liberation against oppression, what Marx called the size of the oppressed, even if they became oppressive themselves, that needs to be appreciated. How did these movements come about? They were reacting to this violent class domination, class formation emerging in their times. So it is no wonder then that all major religions have strong currents of revolutionary thinking set against the established church or temple or mosque. So religion is characterized by the church, the temple, the mosque as these hierarchical structures, highly oppressive hierarchical structures. But within those movements, you have counter movements, counter-hegemonic movements. You've always had them throughout the ages. And in recent times, you've seen liberation theology within the Catholic Church of Latin America. And the current Pope comes from that tradition, although, of course, he's now leading that very institution from the top. But nonetheless, a lot of their thinking does seep through in his own utterances and practices to some extent. Within the Muslim world, you have the Iranian revolutionary Ali Shariati, which had a strong socialist emphasis, very compatible with Marx in many ways, etc. So there is this. The scope for a lot of interaction, a lot of synergy, let's say, between the traditional left, the Marxist left, or even the anarchist left, and these other schools of thinking that have a socialistic inclination. So just to briefly talk about the Buddha's practice during his time and how so if Marx, on the one hand, emphasized the outer transformation of society, and the Buddha emphasized through meditation and good deeds, the inner transformation of the self. Both did not dismiss the inner and the outer in their respective. Marx spoke about alienation, and the Buddha instituted a democratic polity within his ashrams. And this has been written about that Max Weber spoke about Buddhism as being about otherworldly mysticism, detached from the concerns of the day-to-day. But in actual fact, this was a complete and gross misrepresentation. And we have what is called engaged Buddhism, and which draws from Buddha himself, being very much engaged in the affairs of the day. And Gandhi himself embodies that. Yes, Gandhi was a Hindu, but he also drew very much from the Buddha in his reconceptualization of Hinduism. One notable actor in history who adopted Buddhism was King Ashoka in around about the 3rd century BCE. And he is said to have instituted the world's first welfare state and a strong code of ethics, social ethics. Remember, this is in a time of these violent, and he himself, King Ashoka, was practiced that state violence against others, conquering other neighboring communities and states, etc. And then went through a period of immense remorse and became a Buddhist, and spread Buddhism throughout India and as far as Afghanistan and what is now known as Pakistan. And as I said, this inspired Gandhi and his understanding of political practice being, be the change that you want to see. And Gandhi himself, while he had a strong aversion to the practices of the Stalinist communist parties of his time, which advocated violent revolution, and Gandhi did not believe in violence. But he often referred to himself as a non-violent communist. And on the other hand, interestingly, one of India's most famous communist politicians, E.M.S. Namboodiripad, was the chief minister of Kerala on 2 occasions. He himself practiced many of the Gandhian principles of simplicity and personal austerity. The feminist and environmental movements in the 1960s onwards also placed much emphasis on the necessity of activists practicing what they preached. If the structures of patriarchy and inequality were to be fundamentally transformed. Of course, this is vitally important. It's not a footnote, it has to be at the forefront of our politics, of any new politics, democratic politics. Because as we are lamenting the fact that over the past century, and even in recent times, leaders that we admire come into power and then they use state power against the people. Not necessarily, well, there are some exceptions, and Kerala may be an exception in the manner in which they've empowered people, but nonetheless, by and large, that is the experience that we are lamenting. The left coming into power and using the state against the people and against the principles that they fought for. And this is what we are suffering through in South Africa at the moment. For many of you, if you heard about South Africa and the anti-apartheid struggles in the 1980s and 1990s, and we were a beacon of hope, and now we are a beacon of despair. Well, I don't despair because I'm an optimist, but nonetheless, one can despair and then retreat into some form of nihilism if we don't capture a new type of politics and make this and move away from the macho, male-dominated, violent politics, vanguardist politics of the party and of the labor movement and other movements, top-down hierarchical politics.
Devan, would it be possible to come to an end soon so that we still have half an hour for discussion?
Yes. Okay, I'm coming to the end. So while a Marxist frame of thinking needs to be supplemented, and while Marx, as I said, did talk about anti-colonialism, and he did talk about environmental struggles, but of course, Marxist movements can learn a lot from new thinking from environmental activists and anti-colonial thinking. Where Marx was weak was certainly around patriarchy and gender oppression. And the Marxist feminist Sylvia Federici, in her influential work, The Caliban and the Witch, where she argued that Marx's very critical concept of primitive accumulation did not take into account the social position of women and the production of labor power. So that is certainly an area that it's a huge gap in Marxist thinking, although Engels, of course, did write much more about this. So in all these diverse bodies of work, the key is in the combination. So finally, I just want to reflect on another school of thinking that I've been trying to engage with, that draws on Marx and Engels, draws on Silvia Federici and other feminist thinkers, as well as anarchist thinking. And that is the thinking of Abdullah Öcalan, who is the imprisoned leader of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which used to be a traditional Marxist-Leninist party, but then he's thinking, he's regarded as a modern-day Gramsci in prison. In prison in Turkey since the late 1990s. And he's written a lot, many books. I believe he's an exciting thinker that tries to draw together these different elements into what he calls a decentralized democratic alternative or democratic civilization. That places at its center the manner in which patriarchy evolved over the last 5,000 years. And what is called civilization, he starts with the development of the temple in Mesopotamia. And that became the dominating principle that symbolizes this class domination and patriarchal domination around the priest, around the ruler, and then around the economic elites. And what is very interesting about his thinking, which combines all these different thinkers, is that to some extent it is being practiced in the liberated zone of Rojava in northern Syria. And it's quite fascinating to see the manner in which women who from the late 1990s were armed in fighting a war of liberation, but then of course they became very famous for fighting against ISIS. And then the Americans came in and offered support. The Syrian government sort of tolerates them, but the Turkish government is exceptionally hostile to them. But they are trying to build something new with women playing an increasingly decisive role in building this new society. Of course, one could argue that, yes, this is an exceptional circumstance in the context of a war, a liberated zone, a rupture where you can then experiment with something very new and different. But nonetheless, it is quite inspirational. Okay. I went slower than I thought I would. I timed myself and then I went slower. So then that fits in with this utopian thinking and real utopias and how to combine what is possible in the short term in our own context with what is what can be imagined in other contexts, such as Rojava and also in Kerala in India. But let me stop there.
All right, Devan, thank you so much for this tour de force from, reformist measures and revolutionary reforms and the whole bundle of thoughts you presented on the necessity of incorporating ecological ideas, feminist ideas, and also what you called ancient thinking into Marxism. And yeah, on the other hand, being confronted then with some of the identity struggles trying to dismiss Marxism, I think you clearly laid out very interesting lines of opposition, which you described as dichotomies, which should be overcome. And yeah, I think this Buddhist or Gandhian thinking, which you mentioned, is something very valuable. And the interesting story at the end of Abdullah Öcalan actually incorporate or trying to create with the democratic confederalism, which is then practiced in Rojava, such an alternative, I think, is wonderful food for thought.